He lovingly placed Tracy's body in the tunnel with the 8 other women he had killed. Meanwhile, Detective was busy with his investigation. Tuesday, November 10th, 2015. I was working the crossword puzzle in the Philadelphia Inquirer when my phone rang. I picked up the phone and said, "Captain Hobbs." "Good morning, Brian. Special Agent Van Horn here." "Good morning, Kyle. What can I do for you?" "I've got a missing person case I'd like you to take a look at," Van Horn said. "I faxed a copy of the original NPR to you. You might want to look at that while we talk. Hang on a sec while I get your fax." Back in my office, I closed the door, put the phone on speaker to talk and read the missing person report, NPR, at the same time. "Got it," I said. "Give me a second to read through it." The NPR was for Tracy Johnson, reported missing from Reading, Pennsylvania, on November 5th, by her husband. Mrs. Johnson's description said that she was 25 years old. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed 135 pounds. Last seen the evening of October 30th. The report included a picture of the woman and a description of the car that she was driving the night she disappeared. There isn't much here, Kyle. What did the husband have to say? He was out of town on business and returned home on Sunday, November 1st. Mr. Johnson talked to his wife Saturday morning, and she told him she was going to the Allentown Marriott with some friends to attend a Halloween party, Van Horn said. "We spoke with her friends, and they said the last time they saw Tracy, she told them she was going to a haunted house in Brodericksburg with some guy she met." "Not again," I said, mostly to myself. "Not again? What do you mean by not again?" Van Horn said. "Nothing. It's just that these cases always bother me. My experience is that they often don't end well. Anyway, we did a credit card check on Mrs. Johnson, and the last activity on her credit card was a charge for drinks at the Allentown Marriott." Van Horn said, "We'll check it out from this end and find out if Mrs. Johnson came to Brodericksburg. Knew I could count on you. Keep me informed." 5:45 p.m., November 13th, 2015. I was sitting in my office trying to concentrate on the 5 cold case, missing person files I had in front of me. These cases were in addition to the one that arrived on my desk on Tuesday. My back was starting to hurt from being bent over my desk studying the files, looking for something that would help me make sense of them. "Captain Hobbs, do you need me to pull any more files for you?" Sergeant McKinstry asked as he stood in my doorway. "No, I am getting nowhere, and I need to leave soon. Carrie and I are going out to dinner tonight, and I need to get home and change. I'll be leaving shortly." "In that case, I'll be heading home myself," Sergeant McKinstry said. I looked up at the clock and realized that I had been staring at these old files for the last 5.5 hours. Just then, Rich Hanratty stepped into the office. "I thought you would have gone home by now," Hanratty said. "Carrie and Linda will be pissed if we are late for our reservation. I am getting ready to leave soon. Just let me lock these files in my desk, and I'll walk you out," I said. "So, what have you been able to find out about our missing person?" "Well, you know that I went over to Parks and Recreation and talked to them about the haunted funhouse they set up for Halloween. I showed the picture of Mrs. Johnson around, but no one there could remember seeing her. I sent the footage from the security cameras that were active in the park on October 31st to the FBI," Hanratty said. "I also contacted Consolidated Entertainment, the company that provided the amusements for the Halloween celebration. They had cameras set up to capture the faces of everyone who came through their haunted house. I got them to send the files of all the pictures they took to Van Horn. The FBI is running all of the pictures through facial recognition to see if our MP had been to the funhouse. That was on Friday. No results yet. Mrs. Johnson has been missing for a month now. I'm not very hopeful that this will have a happy ending," I said. "Hell, we don't even know for sure if she came here. I hope that she didn't, but I have a bad feeling about this." "Is that why you are looking at all these cold cases?" Hanratty asked. "This missing person case made me think of these old cases. I have a feeling in my gut that these old cases are somehow linked with this new one." Hanratty looked at the files on my desk. "Are you serious? You think this case and the one from 1959 are connected?" "Sounds crazy. I know, but that first case was 56 years ago. We need to talk about this," Hanratty said. "I've asked Van Horn to come up Monday morning, and I want you in the meeting," I said. "Right now, we need to get moving, or you and I may be celebrating the new year alone." I locked the files in my desk and walked out of the station with Rich. When Rich reached his car, he turned to me and said, "See you at 7, and the first round of drinks is on you. I guess I can afford to buy a ginger ale for you. That ginger ale better have at least 2 shots of Jack in it," Rich said as he drove away. Monday, November 23, 2015. Hanratty came into the department conference room Thursday morning with a box of Dunkin' Donuts and a large thermos of their coffee and sat down at the table. He was starting to pour us some coffee when Special Agent Van Horn walked in. "Is that coffee and donuts I smell?" Van Horn said. "Can't have a proper meeting of law officers without them," Hanratty said. "That's why I like coming up here. You guys know how to hold, as you put it, a proper meeting." When the 3 of us each had a cup of coffee and had selected one of the treats Hanratty brought, Van Horn asked, "Is this meeting about our missing person from Reading?" "It's that and more," I said. "Why don't we start with you telling us what your people have found?" Van Horn smiled and said, "Not much, except that we may now have evidence that Mrs. Johnson never came to Brodericksburg." "What evidence is that?" I said. "We found her car." "Let me guess, you found it in Philadelphia," I said. "How did you know that?" Van Horn replied. "I'll get into that later. What else you got?" "The car was found parked along Broad Street with the keys still in the ignition. We think that Mrs. Johnson may have come down to Philly to meet someone, and something went terribly wrong." "Why are we just hearing about this now?" Hanratty asked. "We didn't find out about it until Friday afternoon," Van Horn said. "Philly PD found the car in early November before we were even looking for it. Last week, they were comparing the list of plate numbers from abandoned cars they found against their list of cars reported stolen when someone saw the bolo we put out for that car. That explains what happened to the car, but it doesn't explain what happened to Mrs. Johnson," I said. "Maybe she did go to Philly, and something happened to her while she was there. Let's put that aside for now. I have another possibility to present that is stranger and much more disturbing." Van Horn and Hanratty were both staring at me now. The first case I worked on when I started here in December of 1998 was a missing person case from October 1998. The case hit my desk and detailed the disappearance of Jane Markle. Jane was a 26-year-old housewife reported missing by her husband in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Mrs. Markle had told a friend that she was going to drive down to Brodericksburg to celebrate Halloween in a haunted house with a man she had met. When I went up to Bethlehem to speak with Mr. Markle, he told me that he had been out of town on business and returned on Tuesday, November 3rd. When he got home, his wife wasn't there, and her car was gone. Mr. Markle called some of her friends, and they all said that they had not seen Jane since Friday, the 30th. The friends never told Mr. Markle about the wife's plan to go to Brodericksburg with a friend because they knew she was going with a man and didn't want to tell Markle that his wife was cheating on him. I worked the case for 3 months without a break. I could never find any reason for Mrs. Markle to come to Brodericksburg, found no evidence that she had been here, and we didn't find Mrs. Markle's car anywhere near Brodericksburg. A month later, I got a call from a police sergeant in Bethlehem, and he told me that the police found Mrs. Markle's car in Philly. "You're kidding," Van Horn said. "You don't think it's a coincidence?" Hanratty said. "Could be, but I don't think it is. Maybe Mrs. Markle's description might help you understand my concern. Mrs. Markle was 6 feet tall, weighed 145 pounds, and had blonde hair and blue eyes." "Jesus sounds just like Mrs. Johnson," Hanratty said. "Eventually, I had to move my investigation of the case to our cold files. When I saw Mrs. Johnson's description in the NPR, I went to the cold files to pull the Jane Markle file to compare the 2 cases. While I was in the file room, I found 4 similar missing person cases predating the Tracy Johnson case we are investigating. When I began studying the other case files, it left me with an uneasy feeling. On the surface, the cases seemed to be unrelated. The oldest case, from 1959, involved 2 missing people. The first person reported missing was Margot Winslow, a 26-year-old woman from Brodericksburg. Her husband was a man named Jackson Winslow, and they lived out on the old Cobain place. She was reported missing by her sister in Brodericksburg on November 15th of 1959. "What's the old Cobain place?" Van Horn asked. "The Cobain place is on Wismer Road and dates back to the 1840s. Quimby Cobain built the place, and the Cobain family owned the farm until 1954. It's been referred to as the old Cobain place as long as I can remember." I said, Mrs. Winslow's sister, Karen Bush, and her husband Howard hadn't seen Margot since the day before Halloween, and Karen couldn't get Margot on the phone. Mr. Winslow would not tell Karen where Margot was, so she went to the police. A detective, Mark Rose of the Brodericksburg PD, interviewed Mr. Winslow, a man the detective described as a 32-year-old male who looked more like 25. Jackson Winslow was 6'5" and well-built. When Detective Rose asked Winslow where his Margot was, Winslow said that he didn't know. Rose asked Winslow, "If you don't know where your wife is, why didn't you file a missing person report?" Winslow replied that his wife wasn't missing. She just wasn't there anymore. The circular conversation finally stopped when Winslow told the officer that his wife left him for another man. What Rose finally got out of Winslow was that he had been in Philadelphia on business October 30th and 31st, and got back home around 11 o'clock that Saturday night. Winslow told Rose that his wife was home when he left on Friday morning, but was gone when he returned Saturday night. Winslow told Detective Rose that Margot left him a note stating that she was leaving him. Winslow still had the note, and he gave it to Detective Rose. "It's here in the file." I handed the note to Van Horn. He read it and gave it to Hanratty. Winslow gave the detective permission to look around the property, so Detective Rose explored the house and barn but didn't find any evidence that would indicate that Mrs. Winslow met with foul play. Rose did find that somebody had removed Mrs. Winslow's belongings from the house. At that time, Detective Rose believed that Mrs. Winslow had probably run off with her lover. "You're not going to tell us that the police found her car in Philadelphia, are you?" Hanratty said. "No, but there is more to this story," I said. In December, there was another missing person report. This one for a 28-year-old man named Jerry Adler. Adler had lived in Brodericksburg for just 6 months before he was reported missing by his parents, who lived in Allentown. They had been trying to get in touch with their son for 3 weeks before they called the police. Detective Rose was assigned to the case and went to Adler's apartment, where he found the door padlocked. The landlord told Detective Rose that Adler hadn't paid his rent for November and that the door was locked so that Adler couldn't sneak back and take anything from the apartment until he paid his back rent. The detective had the landlord remove the lock, and then he went inside. There was an open suitcase on the bed and Mr. Adler's clothes were folded neatly on the bed, as if he were preparing to pack them for a trip. Other than Mr. Adler preparing to pack his suitcase, the room seemed to be in order. No sign of foul play. It looked as though Adler was planning to go somewhere, but he never finished packing. Detective Rose talked to Adler's neighbors, but no one knew Adler very well and had no idea where he might have been planning to go or how long he had been missing. One neighbor did say that he had seen Adler out one night with a tall blonde woman. Because Adler had paid his rent for October, but not for November, Detective Rose believed that Adler had probably disappeared about the same time Mrs. Winslow did. The fact that someone saw Adler with a woman who fits Margot Winslow's description caused Detective Rose to believe that Adler's disappearance was connected to the Winslow case. Rose concluded that Adler was the other man mentioned in Mrs. Winslow's note. Detective Rose said that his best guess is that whatever happened to the two of them probably happened on Halloween. Based on his belief that Adler was the man that Mrs. Winslow planned to leave with, Detective Rose got a search warrant and went back out to the Cobain farm with several officers. They went through the house again, searched the barn, and then walked the property looking for signs of a burial site. They also dragged the pond. They found nothing. Care to guess where Mr. Adler's car was found? Philly? Van Horn said. "Give that man a cigar," I said. "Since you got that one right, would you care to take a crack at describing Mrs. Winslow? Tall, blue-eyed blonde?" Yep. Mrs. Winslow and Mr. Adler's cases were kept active for nearly a year before being put in the unsolved case file. Detective Rose put a note in the file stating that he believed that Mr. Winslow was responsible for the disappearance of both Mrs. Winslow and Mr. Adler, but with no hard evidence and no bodies, he had to file the case as unsolved. The next missing person file I read was from 1964 and concerned the disappearance of Tina Bollinger from Trenton, but living in Kutztown where she met and began dating James Parker, I said. The two of them had been together for almost 2 years. Mr. Parker said that he was a restaurant manager and had to work Halloween night, and that Tina was going to go out with friends and would see him after he got off from work. He never saw her again. Mr. Parker filed the NPR on November 3rd. This is where things start to get strange. Friends of Miss Bollinger said that she told them that she was going over to Pennsylvania to visit a haunted house. "Oh crap," Hannity said. "What haunted house were they talking about?" No one knew. The police found no evidence that Miss Bollinger had ever been in Brodericksburg. Then, a month later, her car turned up. "In Philadelphia?" Hannity asked. In all of these cases, the subjects were from all over southeastern Pennsylvania. All the subjects were between 24 and 27 years old, and all of these women fit the same description as tall, blue-eyed blondes, I said. These cases sound very similar, too similar. The women all fit the same description, all went missing on or around Halloween, and the cars associated with every case were found abandoned in Philadelphia. Are you suggesting we have a serial killer here? Do you think one person is responsible for the disappearance of all 6 of these women and one man? Hell, the first case was 1959. So if this perp started when he was 20, he would be 66 years old, Van Horn said. I don't know what to think, I said. I know this doesn't seem to make sense. I told you this would be strange and disturbing. In what years did these women go missing? Hannity asked. I said, 1959 it was Margot Winslow. Then in 1964 it was Brenda Clark. In 1970 Tina Bollinger. In 1981, Karen Martin. In 1998 Jane Markle. And this year, it's Tracy Johnson. Hannity opened his laptop and started typing. When he stopped, he looked up at me and then at Van Horn. Are we in agreement that the disappearances of these women and Mr. Adler are the result of foul play and that they are likely all dead? I looked over at Van Horn and he nodded his head. I agree, I said. Then, if you are right that this is the work of a serial killer and he is following a pattern, then there may be 3 more missing women that we don't know about, Hannity said. What do you mean? Van Horn said. What are you talking about, Rich? I asked. If I am right about the pattern I see in the 6 cases we have here, the disappearances seem to have happened on Halloween. In each of the years you listed, Halloween fell on a Saturday. Well, Halloween also fell on Saturday in 1987, 1992, and 2009. We may very well have 3 more tall, blonde, blue-eyed women missing. The room was silent while we each considered what Hannity said. I looked at Van Horn and said, can you search FBI files to see if there were any NPRs that fit this pattern in 1970, 1992, and 2009? They would have to be cases not brought to the Brodericksburg PD's attention, or we would already have those files. Maybe the Philadelphia PD has a file of abandoned cars found after Halloween in those years. We should also check to see if there have been any similar cases before 1959. If this is the pattern of a serial killer, we had better catch him now because if this case goes cold, Halloween 2020 falls on a Saturday, Hannity said. This is crazy, Van Horn said. You think that we may have a serial killer that has been active for 56 years? Van Horn was reading the cold case files as he spoke. I would be easier to believe this if all these women disappeared over 10 years, but over 56 years is hard to fathom. There is something else all of these women have in common, I said. Van Horn was still reading the files, and he held up his hand to indicate he saw it too. All of these missing women were cheating on their husbands, or in one case, her boyfriend, possibly with the killer. I pointed at Van Horn and said, bingo. In the first case in 1959, Margot Winslow was planning on leaving her husband, which is why Jackson Winslow was a likely suspect in her disappearance. According to Detective Rose's notes, Jackson Winslow was 32 when Margot Winslow went missing, which would make him 88 years old if he is still alive. If Mr. Winslow was responsible for whatever happened to his wife and Mr. Adler, can we assume that he is responsible for any of the other missing women? I looked at Hannity and Van Horn and waited to hear what they thought. I think it is likely that Winslow was responsible for whatever happened to his wife and Adler, but why would he start killing women that looked like his wife, but only on October 31st when it fell on a Saturday? Van Horn said, if Winslow is still alive and 88 years old, could he still be going after women who remind him of his wife? And how could he manage to get these women to go with him? And where would he take them? Or is it possible that he has someone else carrying on for him? Hannity said, I don't have answers, only more questions, I said. I need to find out more about Jackson Winslow. I think I will take a ride out to the old Cobain place and see if Mr. Winslow is still with us. Kyle, Can you check if any women who matched Mrs. Winslow's description were reported missing around the 3 dates Rich suggested? I want to get together again after the holiday. Can you come back up the first week of December? Let me see what I can find out, and if I have any news, I'll come back up. I will also check with Philadelphia PD to see about abandoned cars they found on those dates, but I don't have much hope that we'll turn anything up there after all this time. November 24th, 2015. On Tuesday, Hanratty and I drove out to the old Cobain place to see if we could find out if Jackson Winslow was still alive and where to find him. We got no answer at the door and were about to leave when a man came out of the barn and approached us. The man looked to be about 25 years old and was at least 6'5" and built like an athlete. "Is there something I can do for you?" the young man asked. "Yes, I am Captain Brian Hobbs, and this Lieutenant Hanratty from the Brodericksburg Police Department. And you are?" "My name is Michael Bliss. Now, what is it you want?" "We were hoping to speak with Mr. Winslow. He's not here. Can you tell us where we might find him?" "Don't know. He doesn't tell me what he's doing," Bliss said. "Does he still live here?" "Sometimes." "Do you work for Mr. Winslow?" "I take care of the place," Bliss said. "Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do." With that, Bliss turned and walked back into the barn. On the ride back into town, I asked Hanratty. "Wasn't very helpful, was he?" "He kind of fits the description of Jackson Winslow in the Margot Winslow file," Hanratty said. "I was thinking that, too. I wonder if the two of them are related. I'll have to look into that. I wonder if Mrs. Winslow's sister is still around. I think I would like to talk to her." I dropped Hanratty off at the station, and after getting an address for Karen Bush, Margot's sister, I drove over to her house. I was greeted at the door by a man in his mid-50s. I identified myself, then asked him about Mrs. Howard Bush. He told me his name was Howard Bush Jr., then informed me that his mother had died 3 years ago. "Is there something I can help me with?" "We're looking into the disappearance of your aunt back in 1959. That was before I was born, but I remember my parents talking about it. My mom was always sad that she never found out what happened to her sister." "Did your mother or father ever tell you what they think happened to your aunt?" "They both believe that her husband killed her." "Do you know if your mother had any pictures of her sister and her husband?" "I still have her family album. I think it's still in the bookcase." "Let me check." Howard returned with the album and handed it to me. The most interesting picture to me was of Margot and Jackson at their wedding in 1954. I looked through the rest of the album, but that was the only photo that showed Jackson Winslow. "Any chance I could borrow this picture so I can get a copy made?" "You can have that one." I didn't know either of the people in the picture, so it has no meaning for me. I thanked Mr. Bush and headed back to the station. When I got back to my office, Hanratty was out investigating a break-in at a plumbing supply warehouse. The report said that someone had taken several coils of copper tubing. I didn't see Hanratty again until Monday, Thursday, December 3rd, 2015. Hanratty and I were sitting in the conference room drinking our coffee when Van Horn came in, dropped a file folder on the table, got a cup of coffee and a donut, then sat down. Van Horn smiled and said, "Gotta get my FBI associates to learn how to arrange proper meetings. So that's why you always come here instead of inviting us to your office?" Hanratty said. "Not the only reason." I looked at the file folder on the table, then said, "I hope you have something for us." I found 3 possible matches. The women in these cases fit Margot Winslow's description, but only 2 were reported as missing persons. In November of 1987, Robert Swenson was arrested in the disappearance of his wife, Jennifer. Mrs. Jennifer Swenson was 26 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall. Her eyes were blue, and she had blonde hair. Van Horn pulled 2 copies of the Swenson file out of the folder and handed them to us. Mr. Swenson was a security guard at a warehouse complex in Allentown. In October of '87, he worked the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. till 7 a.m. Tuesday through Sunday. On Saturday, October 31st, Jennifer Swenson told her husband she would spend the night at a friend's house watching scary Halloween movies. At 9:30 that night, a friend of Mr. Swenson called him and said that Jennifer was at Raffles in Bethlehem and she was dancing with some guy, and it looked like they were more than just friends. Swenson called Andy Miller, the other guard on duty that night, and told Andy that he was going to have to leave for a family emergency. Swenson drove up to Bethlehem and went to Raffles. Swenson went into Raffles looking for his wife. and his friend told him that Jennifer left a few minutes earlier with some guy. Witnesses said that Swenson was livid and calling his wife a cheating, which in saying that she would regret cheating on him. When Jennifer didn't show up for work that Monday morning and no one could get her on the phone, her boss called the police. Swenson told the police that he hadn't seen his wife since that Saturday evening, and no one else had seen her. Allentown PD believed that Swenson might have killed his wife, but they could find no evidence to support that theory. Swenson took his own life 6 months later, so Allentown PD closed the case. Van Horn stopped long enough to let that sink in. Allentown PD never tried to find the man Mrs. Swenson left the bar with. All they had on him was that he was very tall and quite handsome, and one of Mrs. Swenson's friends thinks his name may have been Michael. I looked at Hanratty and said, "Michael? Another coincidence? You think this might be the same Michael we met last week?" Hanratty said, "You think this guy you met could be the same Michael?" Van Horn said, "I don't know, but let's talk about that later." "Tell us what else you found," I said. The other 2 cases are similar to the previous one. Both women fit the description, and both disappeared on Halloween, and it appeared that the 2 women were stepping out on their husbands. In 1992, it was 24-year-old Pamela Garner from Scranton. Mrs. Garner told her husband that she was going to Syracuse, New York, to visit her sister. Mr. Garner reported his wife missing 3 days later when he found out that she never arrived in Syracuse and that her sister wasn't expecting her. The Scranton police and the state police of both Pennsylvania and New York found nothing to indicate where Mrs. Garner went or what happened to her. The last case was for Mrs. Emily Redmond of Philadelphia. Same description as the others, disappeared on Halloween in 2009. Mrs. Redmond was taking classes toward her master's degree in education at Penn State, Lehigh Valley. Mrs. Redmond told the girl she was staying with that her friend Michael, who was taking her to see a haunted house. When Mrs. Redmond didn't return to campus on Monday, her roommate called her husband to see if she had gone home, and he filed the NPR. The police tried tracking her cell phone, but there hadn't been any activity on her phone since she left campus on Halloween. "So now we have 9, I said. "Did you find anything before 1959? "Nothing that fits with what we are looking at here," Van Horn said. "So, tell me about this guy you met out at the Cobain place." I told Van Horn about our visit to the Cobain farm and meeting Michael Bliss. "I think Rich would back me up that this guy fits the description of Jackson Winslow." Rich nodded his head and then described the man we met. After we visited the farm, I went to Karen Bush's house. Karen was Margot's sister. I spoke with her son. Mrs. Bush passed away 3 years ago. I pulled the picture of Jackson and Margot Winslow from my pocket and showed it to Van Horn and Hanratty. "That looks like Michael Bliss. Who's the woman?" Hanratty asked. "That's Margot, and the man is Jackson Winslow, not Michael Bliss. This picture is from their wedding in 1954. Bliss looks enough like Winslow that they could be the same person, but Winslow would be at least in his 80s, Hanratty said. "You think Bliss could be Winslow's son or grandson? I think that would be good to know, don't you?" I said. "We have to start somewhere, so I am going with Detective Rose's gut feeling on this. Since all of this began with the disappearance of Margot Winslow, I am going to dig up everything I can about Jackson Winslow. Rich, I was hoping you could do the same with Michael Bliss. We need to see what the connection is between these two. Kyle, can you keep digging to see if you can find anything we haven't discovered on any of these cases? I'll get a couple of guys on this when I get back to Philly." After Van Horn left, I went over to Chief Pasiak's office. When he saw me at his door, the chief waved me in. I noticed that Special Agent Van Horn was here again today. "Can you bring me up to speed on what the 3 of you are working on?" The chief said, "We are looking at 9 unsolved missing person cases that might be related." "Related in what way?" "All 9 of these cases involve a missing woman. In 8 cases, the women were married, and in 1 case, the woman was in a serious relationship. In the first case, there was also a report of a missing man. In all of the cases, the women fit the same description as nearly 6 feet tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes." When I said that, the chief leaned forward and said, "Go on." "As near as we can tell, the women all went missing on October 31st, but in different years. Now is where the story gets strange. The first was in 1959, the next in 1964, then 1970, 1981, 1987, 1992, 1998, 2009, and then again this year. I waited for the chief to digest what I had told him. This has been going on for 56 years? On Halloween? Is there any significance to the years? In each of those years, October 31st fell on a Saturday. 56 years, and you think they could all be connected? That is what we are trying to find out, I said. It's hard to believe that we could have a serial event happening over that long a period and only on those specific dates, the chief said. You think one person is responsible for all 9 cases? That's hard to imagine because our prime candidate for the first case would be 88 years old now. We think someone else must be involved. Who was the first victim? Margot Winslow. She was married to Jackson Winslow, and they lived out at the old Cobain place, I said. My friends and I used to go ice skating on their pond when it froze over. That was back in 65 or 66, I think. I remember that big old house. There used to be a story about the old Cobain place being haunted, the chief said. That got my attention. Haunted? My father told me that back in the 1850s, Quimby Cobain, the guy who built the house, killed somebody and hid the body somewhere on the farm, and that the dead man was haunting the property. I don't know if anybody believed it, but people like ghost stories. I never heard anyone say that the Cobain place was haunted. Why is that important? Before going missing, 4 of these women had told a friend that they were either going to see a haunted house or spend the night in one. In a couple of these cases, the name Michael came up as a potential person of interest. Hannity and I were out at the Cobain place last week, and we met a guy named Michael Bliss. Mr. Bliss looked to be about 25 and bears a striking resemblance to Jackson Winslow. I showed the picture of Jackson and Margot Winslow to the chief. It's almost like they are the same person except for the age difference. We think that they could be related, but we don't know how yet. Maybe a grandson. The chief was looking at the picture and pointed at Winslow. I remember him. I saw him in town once. My dad knew him. When Winslow first moved here, he joined the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, that used to be over on Harrison Street. My dad was a member, and I remember him telling me that Winslow had been a lieutenant in the Army and served in Korea. That's all I remember about him. I plan to find out everything I can about Mr. Winslow. It'll help to know that he was in the service. Keep me in the loop. After I met with the chief, I sent a text to Van Horn and told him that Winslow had been a lieutenant in the Army, and I asked him if he could get Winslow's military records from the Pentagon. Thursday, January 28, 2016. Hannity, Van Horn, and I were in the conference room waiting for Chief Paziak to join us. When he came into the room, the chief looked at the donut box on the table and said, "I hope you saved at least one bear claw for me." Hannity slid the box over to the chief and said, "We saved you too." The chief sat at the head of the table and turned to me. "Okay, Brian, bring me up to speed. It seems that no matter how we try to look at this, we end up back at the old Cobain place," I said. "That's where this all started. There used to be stories that the Cobain place is haunted, and 4 of the missing women mentioning something about going to a haunted house may be just a coincidence, but that is all we have right now. Then there is the mention of the name Michael in 2 of the cases, and the only Michael we can connect to the Cobain place is Michael Bliss. Rich and I have been talking to people all over Brodericksburg, and no one seems to know anything about Michael Bliss. He is seldom seen in town and rarely during the day. We have established that Mr. Bliss is not from here, but we have no idea where he came from, but we are still working on that. I have been back out to the farm to talk to Mr. Bliss, but I haven't seen him since that first time when Rich and I spoke with him. We did a DMV search on Bliss and found 3 different driver licenses for a Michael Bliss in Pennsylvania, but none of them matched our guy. As far as Jackson Winslow is concerned, we still haven't been able to establish if Mr. Winslow is still alive or not. No one has seen him in Brodericksburg in many years. Most of the people that would have known Winslow have either moved away or passed away. The few people we found that knew him said that they hadn't seen him since around 1964. They thought that he had moved away. The DMV has no record of a driver's license in his name in Pennsylvania. Winslow has a P.O. box at the post office, but nobody at the post office has noticed who comes in to pick up the mail. The utility bills and the old Cobain place's property taxes are current and paid on time. We would love to give the Cobain place a full search using scientific equipment, but we don't have enough evidence to prove probable cause to get a warrant. I looked over at Van Horn and said, Did you have any luck getting Winslow's military records? When I requested Lieutenant Winslow's records, I was told that they were classified and could not be released. I got one of our attorneys to request the documents using the Freedom of Information Act. We argued that Winslow left the Army in 1953, so his records should no longer be classified. It took us 4 weeks to work through the system, but we got the documents. We had an agent go to the Pentagon and pick them up. Jackson Winslow is from Los Angeles, California. He attended college at UCLA, and after graduating in 1950, he joined the Army with the officer candidate school option. In September of 1952, Lieutenant Winslow went to Korea. This is where things get strange. In May of 1953, Winslow was wounded and sent to a military hospital in Japan. From there, he was sent back to Letterman Army Medical Center in San Francisco. Shortly after he arrived at Letterman, Winslow was moved to the hospital at Camp Desert Rock, Nevada. Someone at the Pentagon had stuck a note in Winslow's medical records that asked how Lieutenant Winslow ended up at Camp Desert Rock. It seems that the doctors at Letterman believed that Lieutenant Winslow's injuries were terminal and would not live more than a few days, so there was no reason to move him. There was nothing that they could have done for him at Camp Desert Rock that would change the outcome, but less than 2 months later, Jackson Winslow shows up in Brodericksburg looking to be healthy as a horse. "That is strange," Chief Pasiak said. "What would have been going on Camp Desert Rock in 1953 that would have benefited Winslow?" "Didn't make sense to me either," Van Horn said. "Camp Desert Rock is near the atomic test site at Yucca Flat," Van Horn said. "They tested an A-bomb just before Winslow arrived there. I don't see how that could have helped him. I got a strange vibe from this whole thing. So I had a friend at the Pentagon search for officers that graduated from OCS in 1950 or 1951. His search not only found Jackson Winslow, but he also found Winslow's OCS graduation photo. Gentlemen, I believe we have a problem," Van Horn said as he handed me the photo. The only words that came to me when I saw the photo of the newly minted lieutenant were, "Oh shit." As I passed the photo on to Hanratty and then to the chief, I said, "That is not the Jackson Winslow in the wedding photo we have. What the hell does this mean? I know that was a long time ago, but is there any chance we could get a roster of the men at Camp Desert Rock in 1953? I asked Van Horn. "Already working on that." Monday, March 7, 2016. We had no new leads in or missing person cases since our last meeting. Van Horn arrived for the meeting with a large file box. The box weighed at least 15 pounds and was full of loose papers that didn't appear to be in any order. I asked Van Horn, "What's all this, and what are we supposed to do with it?" The records guy at the Pentagon wasn't happy with our request for a roster of the men at Camp Desert Rock in 1953. It seems that he threw anything that he could find that had to do with Camp Desert Rock in the box. I pulled all of the papers out of the box and divided them into 3 piles on the conference table. I suggested that we each take a pile, sort through it, and put the papers in your pile into chronological order, and to set aside anything that does not have a date on it. When we had 3 piles in order, we pulled out anything dated between April and June of 1953. After 2 hours of sifting through the papers, we got to the documents from May of 1953. In that pile, I found a note referring to Lieutenant Winslow's admission to the Camp Desert Rock Post Hospital on May 10, 1953. There was no mention of the lieutenant's condition. Then I found an accident report dated May 12, 1953. "Listen to this," I said. Then I read the report to Van Horn and Hanratty. On the morning of May 12, 1953, a truck carrying 4 soldiers went off the road and down an embankment and caught fire. The 4 occupants perished in the fire. The names of the soldiers involved are Sergeant Michael Bliss, PFC William Locke, Douglas Talley, and Andrew Steinhauer. I look at Hanratty and Van Horn to get their reaction to the story. Hanratty's head snapped up, and he looked at me and then at Van Horn. "What do you think?" I asked them, "Do you think Sergeant Michael Bliss is possibly related to our Michael Bliss?" Hanratty said, "I don't know what to think about this," I said. "Probably just a coincidence. But then again, I think that we will need to get Sergeant Bliss records." I went back to the stack of papers and continued to search through them until I found a document from May 28, 1953. This document was a report on the medical discharge of Lieutenant Jackson Winslow. The report stated that because of his injuries, the lieutenant was no longer fit for military service. The report went on to say that Winslow was being transferred to the VA hospital in Philadelphia. Major Robert Baker M.D. signed the document. I read the report out loud, then said, "Something stinks about this. It looks to me like the Lieutenant Winslow wounded in Korea is not the same Lieutenant Winslow that was medically discharged and showed up in Brodericksburg in June of 1953. Van Horn pulled his cell phone out and made a call to the agent assigned to work with the Army's Criminal Investigation Service stationed at the Pentagon. "Sorry to bother you again, Harvey, but I need another favor. We need to get the military records for Sergeant Michael Bliss, who died in an accident at Camp Desert Rock on May 12, 1953. Van Horn laughed as he listened to the response he got from the agent on the phone. When he finished the call, Van Horn said, "Harvey said he'll get with records and see what he can do. He said that he was sure they would help us because they enjoy digging through records that are over 60 years old. We didn't find anything else in the May or June papers, so we turned our attention to the pile of documents that had no dates on them. Halfway through that stack, Hanratty stuck his hand up to get our attention. "Listen to this," he said. "It's a letter from a Captain Donald Peterson, MD, Letterman Army Medical Center, San Francisco, California, to Major Robert Baker, MD. Major Baker, this letter is to confirm your request that we transfer Lieutenant Jackson Winslow from Letterman to the post hospital at Camp Desert Rock on the 10th. Preparations are underway for the transfer, but I am concerned that the lieutenant may not survive the trip, and I wonder if this transfer is necessary. So, this Major Baker requested that Winslow be transferred to Camp Desert Rock and then wrote up the medical discharge. But it appears that the Lieutenant Winslow that shows up in Brodericksburg is not the same man," I said. Van Horn was already on his cell calling Agent Harvey Lewis to ask him to request information on Major Robert Baker. I signaled Van Horn that I want to say something to him. Van Horn said, "Harvey, to hold on a sec. Ask him to request the full report on the accident that killed Sergeant Michael Bliss also." 20 minutes later, Van Horn got a phone call from Agent Lewis. He said, "What? Tell him I want to talk to the officer in charge." Another 5 minutes had passed when Van Horn's phone rang again. Van Horn listened for a moment, then said, "Captain Hollis, this information is vital to our investigation." "Yes, I know these files are old, but the case we are working on is urgent, and lives depend on our getting this information ASAP. "Thanks, I appreciate that." Chief Paziak came into the room while Van Horn was on the phone and listened to the call. When Van Horn put his cell phone on the table, he looked at me and smiled. "Urgent and lives depend on it?" The chief said, "Well, Halloween does fall on a Saturday again in 2020. Van Horn said, "Anyway, Captain Hollis said he would have his guys get us what we want." The chief looked at his watch and said, "It's almost noon. Why don't you order lunch in and bring me up to date on what you've learned today? Pizza okay with everyone?" The others agreed. So I ordered 5 pizzas and put the charge on my credit card. "You ordered 5 pizzas for the 4 of us?" Van Horn said. "When the guys in the squad room smell those pizzas, they are all going to looking for a slice. I got 2 for us, and 3 will be for the squad room," I said. "Put that on your expense sheet as working lunch," the chief said. I smiled and said, "I was going to." "You guys do have the best meetings," Van Horn said. At 2 p.m., Van Horn got an email with 2 attachments from Captain Hollis. Van Horn forwarded the note to me to upload the attachments to my computer and display them on the large screen on the conference room wall. I opened the first file, and it was a PDF file of Sergeant Bliss' fatal accident report. 4 men fatally injured in a crash on Post Road No. 2 at 1400 hours on May 12, 1953. The 4 men killed were Sergeant Michael Bliss, PCF Douglas Talley, PFC William Locke, and Private Andrew Steinhauer. The 2.5-ton truck driven by PFC Talley was carrying a 50-gallon drum of diesel fuel and was on its way to the motor pool within the Yucca Flat test site when the left front tire blew out, causing the driver to lose control. The truck went off the side of the road, down an embankment, and into a dry wash. The truck rolled over and came to rest upside down in the wash. Diesel leaking from the drum caught fire and consumed the truck and its passengers. The 4 men were pronounced dead at the scene by Dr. Robert Baker, MD, U.S. Army. "This Dr. Baker certainly gets around," Hanratty said. When I opened the second attachment, it contained a news release from the Army to the Cincinnati Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer reporting Sergeant Bliss' death. Sergeant Bliss was from the Cincinnati area. The announcement gave a vague description of the accident, which was unimportant to our investigation. What I found to be important and extremely disturbing was that file photo of Sergeant Bliss included in the news release. There was no mistaking that Sergeant Bliss and the Jackson Winslow that married Margot Kurtz in 1954 were either identical twins or were the same person. I looked at Van Horn and Hanratty and then looked at the chief, and I could tell that we were all thinking the same thing. Are we all thinking that it was Jackson Winslow that died in that truck accident and that Sergeant Bliss replaced him? The chief looked at me and smiled. This is another fine mess you have gotten us into, Brian. I agree, I said. What the hell is going on here? Anyone care to guess? The case you are working concerns 10 missing people over a 56-year period, right? Chief Pasiak said. How is it that this investigation is now looking into what happened 62 years ago at Camp Desert Rock, Nevada? We are trying to investigate all of these missing person cases, but we can't escape the possibility that the disappearances of Margot Winslow and Jerry Adler were the catalyst for the rest of these cases, I said. If Detective Rose was right back in 1959 in his belief that Winslow killed his wife and her lover, then that is our starting point. I think at some point, we are going to have to solve the mystery of Jackson Winslow and Michael Bliss. I can't say that I disagree with you, but while we are pissing around trying to figure out what happened in 1953, the Tracy Johnson case is getting cold. We are rapidly getting to the point where we will have to put this on the back burner and get on with our current cases. I knew the chief was getting frustrated with our investigation's slow pace, but I was sure that he would not pull us off the case. When Van Horn had not yet received the information about Major Robert Baker, we decided to call it a day at 5 o'clock. I suggested that we get together again next week, and Van Horn said that in the meantime, he would forward anything he got regarding any of the players in our insane game of Clue to me. Thursday, March 10th, 2016. It was just after 10 o'clock Thursday morning, and Hanratty and I were sitting in my office talking about what we need to accomplish the rest of the day when Agent Van Horn walked in with a box of donuts. I know we weren't planning to meet again till next week, but I have some information that won't wait. You might want to have Chief Pasiak join us, Van Horn said. I called the chief and told him to meet us in the conference room, and then we headed over there. When the chief came in, he looked at the donut box, smiled, pulled out a bear claw, and sat at the head of the table. I didn't think we were meeting until next week, the chief said as he took a big bite out of his bear claw. Pal has something for us that he didn't think could wait till next week, I said. I'll start with the information on Major Baker. I got late yesterday, Van Horn said. Major Robert Lane Baker graduated from Penn State Medical School in 1934 and joined the Army that same year. His first assignment was at Walston Army Hospital at Fort Dix, New Jersey. In 1941, he transferred to Letterman Army Medical Center in San Francisco, where he served until 1952. That year, the Pentagon made Major Baker the lead medical officer in charge of the atomic weapons test site at Yucca Flat. In June of 1953, Major Baker returned to Fort Dix, where he was head of radiology at Walston. Baker retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1977 and went to work for REORP, a medical lab in Philadelphia. In 1987, a gas explosion at REORP killed Baker and two other doctors who worked with him. Lead medical officer in charge of atomic weapons test site? That's new, but I don't see what that means to us. You must have something more to get you to buy donuts and drive up here, Hanratty said. You're right, and there is more, Van Horn said. What I forgot to mention was that the lab explosion was on October 29, 1987. When I saw that, I checked FBI records to see if we had been involved in the explosions investigation, and it turns out we were. The Philadelphia fire marshal ruled the explosion an accident. Still, he was angry to find out that what was supposed to be a medical lab was actually a chemical lab, and they were working with dangerous chemicals. They would never have been permitted to build the lab where they did if the zoning board knew the true nature of the work to be done there. The fire marshal couldn't find out who owned the building, so he asked the FBI to come in. Well, you know how we work. We were not going to take the fire marshal's judgment that the explosion was an accident. The investigators had concerns about the fire marshal's ruling. The first problem was the size of the explosion. For that much gas to leak undetected before the explosion, the gas had to have filled the lab very quickly. Our team thought it more likely that someone opened several of the gas valves in the lab. While the agents worked their way through the wreckage, they found a small fireproof file cabinet. The cabinet was transported to the FBI forensic lab. Here's where the story gets interesting to us again. Inside the file cabinet, the investigators found a wealth of information about the lab. First off, REORP, which stands for Reduce Effects of Radiation Poisoning, did not build the lab. The building was initially intended to be a connivance store, but the owner went bankrupt before REORP moved in. REORP just bought the empty building and moved in. That is how they escaped scrutiny from the zoning board. Next, there were 3 men responsible for creating the lab in September of 1953. Dr. Robert Baker, whom we already know, and Dr. Jonas Bradshaw, a biochemist, and Dr. Werner Schmidt. Schmidt was a former Nazi scientist. Some of the papers referred to chemical compounds with code names like K-17, H-42, and N-68. Now, here is the most concerning find. There was a logbook that showed appointments for someone only referred to as the sergeant. The appointments occurred once every 6 months, with the first appointment on October 30th, 1953, and then every April and October after. The last appointment for the sergeant was on October 29th, 1987, the day the lab blew up. Our investigators believe that the person referred to as the sergeant opened the gas valves on several of the lab's Bunsen burners, and that he was responsible for the explosion. Unfortunately, they were never able to identify the sergeant. I wish we could turn in our shovels, because this hole is already too deep, Chief Paziak said. There's more. The agents found a notebook that was not in the file cabinet. There was some burn damage to the notebook, but what was still legible was quite interesting. The notebook contained comments about the sergeant's condition. The notes for October 29, 1987, said that his test results are all still normal. Here is the comment that gave me goosebumps. The sergeant still shows no indication that he has aged since the accident in 1953. Somehow I didn't think that referred to the truck accident at Camp Desert Rock. All last night I was trying to think of what other possibilities there could be. On a hunch this morning, I contacted Captain Hollis and asked for information on the 3 soldiers who died in the truck accident with Sergeant Bliss. Hollis got back to me while I was driving up here. What would be the odds that you would randomly pick 4 men to deliver a drum of diesel fuel, and they would all happen to be single and have no living relatives? And then they all happen to die in an accident in the desert with no witnesses, and our Major Baker at the scene of the accident to pronounce the 4 men dead? Who do you think the sergeant is? The chief said. I hate to say it, but I believe we are all thinking it, I said. Winslow told Detective Rose that he was in Philadelphia when his wife disappeared. Could he have been there for his 6-month checkup? Baker was a major when this all started, and I guess that he refused to refer to their patient as Lieutenant Winslow, but he didn't want Michael Bliss' name anywhere in his notes, so he referred to him as the sergeant. Brian, give me your best guess at what we are looking at, the chief said. I closed my eyes for a minute to gather my thoughts. Okay, I think this all started back at Camp Desert Rock, where I believe Major Baker was involved in something that went terribly wrong. I think that Sergeant Bliss and the 3 other men that supposedly died in the truck accident had also been involved in Major Baker's screw-up, and he had to find a way to clean it up. I'm guessing that Locke, Talley, and Steinhauer died due to Major Baker's actions, but Sergeant Bliss survived. Whatever Major Baker was involved in, he needed to keep Sergeant Bliss from talking to anyone about it. Major Baker found out about a dying Lieutenant Winslow, who happened to have a similar build to the Sergeant Bliss, and had him transferred to Camp Desert Rock. Then he staged the truck accident, put Lieutenant Winslow's body in the truck with Locke, Talley, and Steinhauer, instead of Sergeant Bliss. The major sent Sergeant Bliss to Philadelphia to become Jackson Winslow, and the appointments every 6 months were set to monitor the sergeant's health changes, but according to their notes, there were no changes in his health from 1953 until 1987. The notes the FBI found during their investigation seem to suggest that whatever happened to Sergeant Bliss has stopped him from aging. That's hard to believe, but it does explain why no one has seen Jackson Winslow. He has to hide because people would notice if he didn't age over the last 62 years. So, Michael Bliss comes back looking like he did when he was 25. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can put things together in a way that makes any sense to me. As to the missing women, I'm guessing that Winslow came home from his checkup at REORP on October 31, 1959, found his wife with Jerry Adler, and in a fit of rage, killed both of them. If Detective Rose had been able to find the bodies back then, I don't think we would be here talking about any of this right now. Kyle, do you agree with Brian's take on this? Chief Pasiak said, I don't like it, but I don't see any other explanation that fits the information we have. I say information instead of facts, because we can't prove any of this. To get to the bottom of this, we will need to talk to Michael Bliss and search the old Cobain place. I guess it's time to get the district attorney involved in this. The chief said, He's gonna love this, Hanratty said. And what judge is going to give us a search warrant based on what we have? The chief stood up and said, Brian, I want you to write up your analysis of what happened the night of October 31st, 1959, at the old Cobain place using the information in Detective Rose's report from that time and adding in your thoughts on the case. Yes, sir, but I don't understand the purpose of doing that, I said. How do you eat an elephant? The chief said. One bite at a time, I replied. I will take this to the DA as a cold case we are trying to close and try to get you a search warrant for the entire Cobain farm. If you find anything incriminating to either Winslow or Bliss, we'll go from there. That would be great, I said. Kyle, do you think you could get us a ground-penetrating radar unit to use if we get a chance to search the farm? When you get a search warrant, send a request for a GPR to me, and we will make it happen, Van Horn said. It took a month, but on Tuesday, the 14th of April, Chief Pasiak finally convinced the DA and a judge to give us the old Cobain place search warrant. I sent a note off the Van Horn requesting their assistance in our search, mainly to provide us with a GPR unit and a trained operator to use it. I could have asked the state police, but I knew that Van Horn wanted to be involved in the search. We planned to serve the warrant Wednesday morning. With the upcoming search of the Cobain property still on my mind when I walked into the house that evening, I walked past Carrie without giving her my usual kiss. When I got upstairs to our bedroom, Carrie was right behind me. Did I do something wrong? Carrie said, What? No. Why would you ask me that? I said, You walked past me without saying hello or giving me a kiss. I turned to her, grabbed her around the waist, and bent her over backward and said, I am sorry. Then I kissed her. When I let her up, Carrie was smiling and said, Wow. I forgive you. Now, have you got any more of those for me? I kissed her again and said, You'll have to wait till after dinner to get the rest. You looked lost when you came into the house. You have a bad day? Carrie said, Why don't you fix us a drink while I change, and I'll come down and tell you all about it. In the past, I would never talk to Carrie about a case I was working. It may have been the right thing to do, but it almost cost us our marriage once. After that, I keep her informed of what I am doing if there is any chance that what I am doing can affect us. I know I can trust her to keep what I tell her in confidence, and I never want to come close to losing her again. I spent nearly an hour telling Carrie the story about the missing person cases and what I believe to be a connection to the old Cobain place. Then I told her the Michael Bliss, Jackson Winslow story. Carrie never said a word while she listened to me. When I finished, she said, Are you serious? That sounds like the script for a Halloween horror movie. Unfortunately, what I told you is the most likely answer to what we are looking at, I said. I could tell by the look on her face that Carrier did not doubt me. She was just having a hard time accepting the possibility that the things I told her could happen. I was getting the feeling that something was stressing you out over the last several weeks, Carrie said. Why didn't you ask me about it before? Carrie put her hands behind my head and pulled me to her and said, I didn't want to add to your stress, and I knew that you would eventually tell me what was going on. Then she kissed me, and as she was pulling away, she reached down with her right hand and gave me a little squeeze that gave me a big reaction. When we get to bed, I will give you all the stress relief you need, she said. Now I have to get out dinner on the table. I still had a lump in my pants when I sat down at the table, and Carrie noticed it with a smile. Wednesday, April 15th, 2016. Wednesday morning, Hanratty and I went to the Cobain place with a team of 7 Brodericksburg police officers. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. So I taped a copy of the warrant to the door and waited for Van Horn to arrive. 5 minutes later, 2 FBI trucks came up the long driveway. One of the trucks was pulling a trailer with a small boat on it. When Van Horn got out of the truck, I asked him about the boat. The boat has side-scan radar that will allow us to see if there is anything on the bottom of the pond that shouldn't be there, Van Horn said. Have you served the warrant yet? Nobody home, so I taped the warrant to the door. We are good to go. Van Horn spoke briefly with a couple of his agents, and they backed the boat trailer down to the pond, launched the boat, and got busy scanning the bottom of the pond. When I saw the GPR rolling off the truck, I wondered how the operator was going to roll that thing over 20-plus acres of farmland, covering a path only a few feet wide on each pass. The operator introduced himself as Larry Nelson and said the lawn between the barn and the house looked like a good place to start because the ground was flat. He said, "I'll make a test run here to make sure the equipment is working correctly." He walked in a straight line parallel to the side of the barn. He went about 50 feet, turned around, and came back along a line about 4 feet to the right of his first pass. When he got back to where I was standing with Van Horn, Larry said, "There's an anomaly under the ground here." Van Horn and I both moved over to look at the GPR's screen, but nothing I saw there made any sense to me. It was just a bunch of lines at different angles. "Let me try that pass again and see what we get," Larry said. He started in the same place he made the first pass, moved what I would estimate at 6 feet in from the driveway, and stuck a wire with a red flag on it into the ground. He moved another 2 feet, stuck in another flag. Larry moved forward another 6 or so feet and put down another flag. Before Larry got to the other side of the lawn, he had placed 5 flags. Larry then moved about 5 feet to his left and started back toward us, placing flags along the way. When he got to us, Larry moved the GPR to our right and started across the lawn again. In all, Larry made 20 passes and about ran out of his little flags by the time he finished. "What did you find?" Van Horn asked Larry. "There is something down there. Come take a look at this." Van Horn and I followed Larry over to the barn and stopped next to the first flag he put down. "Look down the lines of the flags," Larry said. There were 5 rows of flags, all in straight lines. Before I got to this first marker, there was an area the GPR penetrated down about 4.5 meters. It's unusual to go that deep unless you are scanning through material like dry sand. This first flag marks an anomaly that is about 3.0 meters down and runs to the side of the house. The second flag indicated something solid that is only 1.2 meters down. As I move to the middle flag, the surface of whatever is under us rises to 0.76 meters, then drops back to 1.2 meters at the next flag. The last flag marks an anomaly at 3.0 meters, and then I get another reading down to 4.5 meters. As you can see by looking at the flags, whatever lies below the ground here seems to run from the barn to the house. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "The impression I get is like the arched top of an underground tunnel. I've seen this kind of thing before." I looked at Van Horn and said, "A tunnel? That's not all. I would guess that both sides of the tunnel have been filled with sand with enough extra sand to cover the top." "Why sand?" "It's not like the soil around here is sandy," I said. "I'm guessing to keep the tunnel dry. Rainwater and snowmelt would rapidly drain through the sand. The anomaly I found at 3 meters down on both sides of the structure, I think could be French drains to remove water as it sinks through the sand. If Quentin Cobain built a tunnel here in the 1850s, where would he get all that sand and the materials to build a tunnel?" I said, "Don't know about the stones for the tunnel, they could be local, but the sand probably would most likely have been brought up the river on barges. I guess we will have to find a way into the tunnel. Rich, you go with Kyle and see if you can find an entrance from the barn, and I'll take our new friend, Larry, and we'll go into the cellar and see if we can find it." I said, "Before we go, I need to get something from the truck," Larry said. When Larry returned, he was carrying a little red box with 4 wheels and a handle that looked like a gamer's control stick. "What's that?" I asked. "It's a handheld GPR. It could help us find the door to the tunnel," Larry said. I got 2 flashlights from my car and handed one to Larry, and we headed down into the cellar. Even with the cellar lights on, it was hard to see anything. We managed to find the cellar wall area where an entry to the tunnel would most likely be. I was examining the wall, looking for any sign of a door or gateway, but I could not see any. I stopped for a second and saw Larry holding his handheld GPR, and he was rolling it along the wall the way a little boy would roll a toy car on the wall. Larry stopped just to my left and said, "The tunnel starts here." Then he continued another 10 feet or so and stopped and said, "This is where it stops. If there is a way in, it has to be right here between us." I examined the wall again, but still couldn't find a door. "There might be some sort lever to release the door," Larry said. "You're tall, so you look along the top of the wall, and I'll look along the bottom." When I didn't see anything, I started feeling around between the floor joists. I found it between the joists just above where Larry said the tunnel began. It felt like a metal handle. I pushed down on it, but it didn't move, so I pulled up, and when I did, I heard a clank, and a large section of the wall pivoted open with minimal sound. I looked into the darkness inside the tunnel and wondered what might be waiting for us in there. I tried to call Hanratty and Van Horn, but I wasn't getting a cell or a radio signal. So I asked Larry to go over to the barn and tell them we found the door. While Larry was gone, I stepped inside the tunnel and was surprised to see how big it was. My flashlight beam could not penetrate to the other end. My first thought was that this tunnel would be the perfect place to hide the bodies, but there was no smell that would indicate the presence of any. Tina Johnson disappeared 6 months ago, but I would have expected there would still be a lingering smell of decomposition if she was in there. I dragged my foot across the tunnel floor and could feel that it was composed of compacted dirt. That made me wonder if the bodies could be under the tunnel's floor. While I waited for Van Horn and Hanratty, I stepped another 10 feet into the tunnel but had to stop when there was a bright flash of light, a loud bang, and the ricochet of a bullet hitting the way just to my left. I dropped to my knees and turned off my flashlight. Apparently, Michael Bliss was hiding in the tunnel. Michael Bliss, don't shoot. I'm Captain Hobbs of the Brodericksburg Police Department. You're trespassing. You have no right to be here, Michael said. I have a search warrant that gives me the legal right to search the property. It's taped to the kitchen door. Come on out, and I'll show it to you. You get out of here. Get off my property. Michael, this is not your property. It belongs to Jackson Winslow. I only said that to gauge his reaction. That's what you think. Oh yeah, I forgot. You are Jackson Winslow and Michael Bliss, aren't you? I bet you have one hell of a story to tell, and I would love a chance to hear it, I said. Like I am going to trust you. You're just like everyone else. All you want to do is to put me in a cage like a lab rat. You can forget it. If you fight us, you will end up getting yourself killed. It would be a relief if you could, but you can't kill me. I am immortal. Just then, I could hear several voices coming into the cellar. I could see their flashlight beams as they approached the tunnel doorway. I yelled over my shoulder, "Turn your flashlights off. Michael is in the tunnel, and he is armed. Are you okay?" Hanratty yelled back to me, "I am fine." He fired once and missed. "What do you want to do?" "Stay where you are. I am coming out." When I got out, I asked Van Horn if they left anyone in the barn looking for an entrance. "We left 2 agents over there. We couldn't find a door, but they are still looking. We need to get word to them that Michael Bliss is in the tunnel, and he is armed. He may be able to open a door on that end from inside the tunnel, so they need to be ready if he tries to slip out that way. You'll have to go outside to call them. There is no cell or radio reception down here." Van Horn rushed out of the cellar to make the call. "Do you think he is hiding the bodies in there?" Hanratty asked. "I don't know, let me ask him," I said. With the cellar dark, I opened the tunnel door again and stepped back inside. I pulled out my recorder and turned it on before speaking to Michael. "Michael, are you still here?" "Where else would I be? I can hear your friends banging on the wall in the barn, so I have no way out. Can I ask you a question?" "Guess I can't stop you, but I might not answer," Michael said. "When you killed Margot and Adler, did you bury them down here?" He was quiet for a minute, and I thought he wouldn't answer me, so I started to ask him again when he interrupted me. "I never wanted to hurt her, but she cheated me. Is she buried in here?" "No, Margot is not buried in here. She is beside me right now. She has told me that she has forgiven me." "Margot talks to you?" "Yes, she talks to me all the time. That is except for the times she runs away, and I have to go find her." "How many times has Margot run away?" 8 times. When she goes, it's always around Halloween. That was one of our favorite times together. She ran away 8 times over the last 56 years? How old are you, Michael? I'll be 88 on October 11th. I bet you don't believe me. I believe you, Michael. What do I have to do to get you to put down your gun and come out of here with me? I can't leave Margot, and the Virginian told me that I couldn't trust you. Who's the Virginian? Just someone that was already here when I found this tunnel. And he talks to you? Yes. The Virginian always tells me when Margot has gone away and what I have to do about it. Michael, I'm going to go back into the cellar for a while, but I'll come back so we can talk some more. I said. "I would be happier if you just left me alone." "Sorry, Michael, but I can't do that." I slipped back out of the tunnel and joined Hanratty, Van Horn, and Larry in the cellar. "He hears voices," I said. "He believes that his dead wife talks to him, and someone he calls the Virginian also speaks to him." "Who the hell is the Virginian?" Hanratty said. "I have no idea. He said the Virginian was there when he found the tunnel. He says he won't come out of there because he has to stay with Margot. How are we going to get him out?" Hanratty said. "Any ideas?" I said. "We have riot gear in one of the trucks," Van Horn said. "Riot gear? We have one guy in a tunnel, not exactly a riot." I said. "What I was going to say is that included with the riot gear, we have gas masks, tear gas, and night vision goggles," Van Horn said. "We toss in a tear gas canister, wait a minute, then go in and bring out." "Sounds like a plan." 10 minutes later, we were ready to go in. Van Horn, Hanratty, and I slipped inside the tunnel and put on the gas masks and night vision goggles. On my signal, Van Horn threw a gas canister toward the far end of the tunnel. Within a minute, we could hear Michael coughing. The three of us moved as quickly and quietly through the tunnel as we could. I spotted Michael squatting down and trying to rinse the tear gas from his eye with a bottle of water. The three of us rushed him before he could do anything to defend himself. Hanratty and I pined Michael down while Van Horn cuffed him. As we got Michael on his feet, I told him that he was under arrest for the murder of Margot Winslow. Then I read him his rights. Once Michael was taken away to be booked, we went back into the tunnel to search for Margot's body and others we might find. The tear gas was still clouding the air, but we found the latch to open the door into the barn end of the tunnel. I called the station and asked Sergeant McKinstry to bring a couple of large fans out to the farm so we could clear the gas from the tunnel. McKinstry arrived about the same time the state's crime scene investigators arrived. It took 15 minutes to clear the air enough for the investigators to enter the tunnel. The crime scene team brought in powerful quartz lights on tripods to light the tunnel. Van Horn, Hanratty, and I followed the team as they proceeded through the tunnel. It was somewhere about in the middle of the tunnel when we made a gruesome find. There were 14 bodies in the tunnel. 9 of the bodies were naked women, 1 a naked man, and 4 men dressed in clothes that looked very old. Surprisingly, the bodies weren't just piles of bones. The bodies had become mummified. I looked at Alan Simpson, the lead on the CSI team, and he said, "I have seen this happen before, but never around here. It takes the perfect combination of dry air, temperature, and absorption capacity of the underlying soil. It appears that we have that perfect combination in this tunnel." After that, Van Horn left to report what we found to his boss, and Hanratty went back to the station to tell the chief. I stayed with the crime scene boys. At 5 o'clock that evening, the state coroner picked up all 9 bodies that were Michael Bliss' responsibility and sent them to the morgue for identification and autopsies. One of the crime scene guys found a letter in the pocket of one of the 4 remaining bodies. The letter was from Henry Wise, the governor of Virginia, requesting local law enforcement's assistance in searching for the runaway slaves. The letter was dated September 25, 1857. A forensic anthropologist was notified about the find, and arrangements were made for him to be there tomorrow morning. As the crime scene team packed up their gear and prepared to leave, I closed the barn's tunnel entrance. I was walking back toward the cellar entrance as I saw the last CSIs go, so I hurried to catch up to them. As I passed the 4 men still on the floor of the tunnel, I heard a voice clearly say, "Tell Governor Wise what happened to us." I hurried to get out of the tunnel, pushed the door closed behind me, and tried to convince myself that I didn't hear anything. Over the next several months, the state coroner's office was able to identify all of the women as being those in the missing person cases we were working. They also identified the naked man as Jerry Alder. The forensic anthropologist determined that the 4 men in the tunnel were bounty hunters who made their living hunting down runaway slaves. The 4 men were all carrying sidearms, but all had been shot dead with the same pistol. Based on the clothes, the letter they carried, and the guns in their holsters, the 4 men died a short time after Governor Wise wrote that letter for them. Michael Bliss told the story of the failed experiment in April of 1953, which resulted in Locke, Talley, and Steinhauer's deaths. He confirmed that he became Jackson Winslow to hide his true identity. Michael was asked how he was able to survive without ever holding a real job. He told the interviewer that he was paid $3,000 a month until 1987 when he blew up the Reorp lab. What did you do then, Michael? By then, I was getting Jackson Winslow's Social Security check every month, and I had made some investment back when this started that helped me later. What kind of investments? IBM, Xerox, AT&T, and Standard Oil. Those stocks did very well for me. Michael was never tried for the murders he committed. In a strange twist of fate, it seems that when we tear-gassed him in the tunnel, the gas reacted with something in his body, and he began to age rapidly. His outward appearance didn't change much. It was his liver, lungs, heart, kidneys, and other organs that started to shut down. He lived for 2 months after his arrest. His cause of death was listed as heart failure, but it could have been any of his organs that did him in. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.